Hey folks, welcome to this lesson. In this lesson, we are going to be focusing on setting up the front end for our app. So far we have been learning how to write Solidity smart contracts, how to make sure to write secure Solidity smart contracts. But what about the front end, which actually connects and acts as a user interface for users to interact with your contract, right? So in this particular lesson, we'll be introducing two new interesting concepts in the front end. One is called Next.js and another one called Tailwind CSS, right? So I am not going to be going through something specific in Next.js, but just an overview of what is Next.js. I'm going to be using the documentation itself. So if you do want to deep dive into it, you have the ability to sort of come back and do it on your own, right? So we're going to look at a little bit about what is Next.js, some architecture, and then try to tinker and poke around a little bit with Next.js itself. So as mentioned over here, if you are familiar with React, which is a library that helps you create front end for users to interact with your applications, be it web applications largely, but of course React also provides the ability to create mobile friendly applications. So right now we are only bothered about web applications, so let's focus on that. Now, Next.js is a flexible React framework, right? Which basically provides you these small building blocks to create faster web applications. Is it important for you to be an expert in Next.js? No. But is it required for you in order to build a dApp, to be able to understand how the front end works? Then I would say yes. And that's why we are doing this entire module, right? Which is focused on front end. So let's see, if you are new to React as well, you don't have to worry about it. Let's just look at Next, and then, React is its own sort of beast to handle, right? So there are a couple of things that we have to keep in mind while we are building a web application. First is the user interface, right? How will users consume and interact with your application? In our case, we will be focusing on building decentralized applications, right? So, and user interface is one of the biggest concerns when it comes to building decentralized applications, right? There aren't enough good applications having a pleasant or a user friendly interface. So, how can you build that? Perhaps Next.js can help. Routing, right? How do users navigate between different parts of our applications? Data fetching, where the data lives and how to get it. In our case, let the data lives on the blockchain. So we can fetch the data from the blockchain by sort of using Ethers.js or listening to events. Or we can also use Graph protocol where we can query using the GraphQL endpoints, or we can use which provides REST APIs to be able to query data from the blockchain, right? So that's what it is going to be for us when it comes to data fetching. Rendering, how do we render the content that needs to be shown to the user? Then integrations, right? We can have integrations, both third party integrations on our application, and in our case, also integration between the user interface and the smart contract itself. And think of integrations like, say, if you want to pay using a decentralized, say, Circle Pay, right? If you want to pay using USDC, that's an integration. Wallet, connecting to wallet, which is a very basic integration, right? That we need in almost every decentralized infrastructure. Where do we deploy, store, and run our application code, right? In our case, we can also think about decentralized infrastructure, like using things like Spiron protocol or using things like CR network, where you can deploy the front end itself in a decentralized manner, or even thinking about like Arweave or decentralized storage, right? Performance, how do we optimize our application for end users? This is again very, very important, because one of the other drawbacks building a Web3 application or building a decentralized application is that performance wise, there is a huge gap in terms of how traditional applications are built, right? Scalability, how does our application adapt as it grows to scale, right? As more and more users come, as more and more data comes into picture, as traffic grows, how do you adapt, right? Developer experience, one of the most important things, but sometimes very underrated, right? What is the experience in building this application as well as maintaining this application in long term, right? So for each part of these, you know, these things that need to be considered by building an application, we will need certain plugins, interfaces to help us. So if you're not familiar with React, as I already mentioned, it's a JavaScript library for building interactive user interfaces. So basically the elements that users see and interact with on screen, right? For example, a form, a logo, a card, a navigation bar, menu bar, right? Things like that. So Next.js is a React framework that gives you building blocks to create web applications. So by framework, it means that Next.js handles the tooling and configuration needed for React, right? Because React is a library, sometimes it can be very overwhelming, but we can use Next.js, which is a framework, and it handles everything for you. And it also provides additional structure, features, and optimizations required for our application. So when you look at a simple client-server architecture, of course, in our case, you can think of the server or the database itself being replaced by the blockchain network. And then you can also have decentralized authentication and authorization, etc. built on top. So you have your application, right, your client side, where the UI is built with React, and then you have your CSR, SSR, you have routing, you have data fetching, all of that happening in the front end. And then you have your backend where, for example, in our case, it could be a Solidity smart contract where you're going to fetch data from and things like that, right? So you can use the React to build your UI and then incrementally adopt Next.js features to solve things like routing, data fetching, integrations. And this will help you improve the developer and end user experience, right? So we'll not go through the create your first app tutorial in this particular video, but perhaps we'll take a quick peek at it in the next video when we also talk about and introduce Tailwind CSS, right? And of course, as a part of the lesson, we'll be setting up our own front-end repo and perhaps also tinkering a little bit with some lines of code.